quest for devising some system of justifying how one arrives at knowledge, not everyone has been satisfied with the system we discussed last time, rationalism, which is built upon two premises. One, innate ideas that one is either born with, or as Plato and some of the other heathen philosophers have said, that owe their derivation to an immaterial pre-existence of the soul, which of course the Bible would deny, although maybe Christians haven't spent as much time, some anyway, some Christians perhaps have not spent as much time as some of the heathens have, wondering where they came from, or maybe wondering, to state it a little better, where they were before they were. I was even thinking of that today because of some reading in some theology books. It's a rather profound thing to wrestle with. Was there ever a time when you were not? And, well, we don't even want to get into that. So another thing they have brought up is empiricism. Empiricism. Let me spell that for you. Probably some of you know how anyway. E-M-P-I-R-I-C-I-S-M. Empiricism. Empiricism is the experience method, the observation method. So this is the second solution to the origin of knowledge. Some proponents of this have been people like Berkeley, Hume, Locke, a Scottish philosopher, David Hume, and Locke, L-O-C-K-E. And probably the man who came as close as any to being a consistent empiricist would be John Stuart Mill, the American philosopher of some time ago. No one has really been able to hold to either rationalism or empiricism, or the third thing we'll get to later on, consistently. They have found out that it as a system will work for various parts of knowledge which an individual has. Empiricism certainly works partially, but it's another question whether it works all the way. So people like Plato have dabbled in several of these, and really all have, but John Stuart Mill came as close as any to being a consistent empiricist. All right, let me give you a little introduction to empiricism, and then we'll mention some of the negative voices which have been raised against it. I would say that empiricism has been much more popular in the 20th century because of the popularity of modern science and its worshipped methods. You know that science, the scientist, whether he is a medical scientist or some other type of scientist, has practically been deified here in the end of the 20th century. And that's because of the methods of knowledge, of acquiring knowledge, that he thinks he has and that others ascribe to him. Now, if you understand what I'm saying now, or if you believe what I'm saying now, that the scientist has practically been deified, then there must be a reason why. And I want to show you why. It's because of this theory of knowledge called empiricism. We're dealing with something a little abstract here in epistemology, but everything abstract has a practical outworking, or we wouldn't be wasting our time talking about it. People really do worship modern science and its methods. They think that they're more or less infallible. And we're going to discuss some of the methods. The methods are empirical methods. E-M-P-I-R-I-C-A-L, empirical methods. Great thinkers like Francis Bacon and Newton told the world, forget about these ancient traditions, these ideas of intuitive knowledge, the innate ideas that almost have some type of, they would say, mythological or certainly pre-scientific connotations to them. So forget about those ancient traditions of pre-existence, and forget about all these fancy speculations and deductions. Oh, I didn't go on to say what I was going to say a moment ago. Rationalism is built on two premises, innate ideas, and once you have that basis called the criteria, then you build on that by means of deductive reasoning. Not inductive, that's another method, but by deductive reasoning. And so Bacon and Newton said, no, forget about that. Go straight to the facts. Forget about this philosophical, intuitive knowledge and so forth. Go straight to the facts. Collect the specimens. make observations, weigh, analyze, record facts in a journal or in a diary. I mean, doesn't that sound like the modern laboratory? You go out and find your specimens, you collect them, you make observations over an extended period of time, and you might check it against a couple of perceived or probable flaws or whatever. You weigh, you analyze, you detect this relationship between this species and that species. You check the color. If it's an animal or something or a plant, you put it in a cage or aquarium or whatever and observe. You observe. This is the empirical method here. And I mean, this would have to be the infallible method, a lot of people would say, because you're dealing straight with the facts. I mean, this is really where people are in Western society today. They worship the empirical method. They tell us that gradually, it doesn't happen overnight, but gradually a body of knowledge will grow from the observed data. Your scientists, all of your professors that are working at the universities, you know, to be a professor, you can't just stay there and teach, but you've got to do research and write and publish, and you don't write and publish, and you don't ever get tenure there. You get tenure, you can't get fired, unless there's some extravagant infraction which has been committed by the professor. But you've got to do something. And so you read about, where do we get so much of our knowledge, our scientific knowledge? We get it from university professors. You read about how, well, back in 1951, someone began measuring the toxic level of something in the atmosphere. And you can't measure that just on May 18th of 51. You got to measure it the next day and the next day and over that decade and the next decade and the next decade. And pretty soon, gradually, a body of knowledge will grow from all of this observed data. This is the eyewitness, the sense-experienced method. And the empiricist tells us that it's the reliable method because any person can simply go out there, check it out, verify it for himself. I mean, you're dealing with specimens, you're dealing with reality, with mushrooms growing or toad frogs that sit underneath them or whatever. You're dealing with reality, real, known, observable facts. Anyone can go and check it out and verify it for himself. Now, the empiricist is generally not quite as hungry for certainty as the rationalist. The rationalist wants certainty. The empiricist generally isn't as hungry for certainty. He'll take 98% certainty. He's satisfied with that. And you know how most of your experiments are something like that. They're always give or take this. They always have a margin of error that we're told about. So 95, 96, 97, 98%. But although the empiricist is not as hungry for certainty, he actually feels that his method leads to greater certainty because you don't have to deal with these things that you can't deal with, called innate ideas. How are you going to weigh and analyze and observe the data called innate ideas? Or how are you going to empirically observe and verify an immaterial pre-existence of the soul? I mean, such religious, pre-scientific, philosophical, ontological, metaphysical whatevers are way beyond the scientific mind. He wants to be able to see it, something that he can put on a scale and weigh, and he can check and fill up a whole book on observations about it. I mean, after all, what do you really believe the most? That the laws of logic or mathematics are certain, or that the color of your hair is the color that you believe that it is? See, the rationalist, we go back to the first, he talks about the laws of mathematics. A triangle has to have three sides and has to have three angles. Well, you're pretty certain on that. But again, that's kind of something that's a little hard to get your hands on. What are you more certain about? That your hair is red, blonde, brown, black? Or that a triangle has three sides and three angles? What are you most certain about? Well, the empiricist would say it's obvious. You're most certain about what you cannot deny because all you have to do is go look in a mirror. And you'll find out exactly what color your hair is. Perhaps you've not met that triangle that has four sides. You've met a whole lot of triangles, but perhaps you haven't met the one that has four sides. But how can you say that you haven't met you? You know the color of your hair. You see, the empiricist thinks that this is certain. This is a way to certainty here. You know the color of your hair. Unless it's one of those general colors, kind of reddish, brownish, blackish, blondish. But at least you know it's not green or purple, like some of your neighbor's hair. The empiricist says that you generally believe what you see. You generally believe what you see, what you have experienced, what you can demonstrate. You generally believe the experiment someone else tells you about whenever you can go out, mix the same formulas, end up with the same experiment on your hands. You say, well, that's science right there. That's right. That's exactly right. That's modern science with its worshipped methods of empiricism. Going back to this business of innate ideas, the empiricist is totally opposed to that. He believes that whenever one comes into the world, it's an ancient phrase here, but his mind is a tabula rasa. A tabula, you'll see this term again, rasa. T-A-B-U-L-A, 2 words, R-A-S-A. You know what a tabula rasa is? A blank tablet. In other words, this word, this phrase right here, tabula rasa, is going to always have to be connected in your mind with anyone who opposes any doctrine of innate ideas or intuitive knowledge. Okay? You've got to remember that. That's the empiricist. He's the one who's opposed to innate ideas or intuitive knowledge. Innate ideas, a rationalist says you come into this world in conception. I mean, the moment of conception. And there's certain things that you already have with you. I mean, as far as up here is concerned, we know there's a physical aspect to you, but there's something beyond a physical aspect to you. Whether you want to call it a spiritual or a psychical or a mental or a psychological or whatever, the rationalist says you've got more than what you can see. And the empiricist says no, because how would you know? How can you weigh it and analyze it and prove it? The empiricist will only believe what he can prove, what he can see. I mean, he doesn't have to see it as long as he can prove it. And how can you prove something that you can't get your hands on? So he said whenever a man comes into the world, whether it's conception or birth, his mind is a tabula rasa. It's a blank tablet. It has nothing on it. And through sense experience, impressions are made upon the mind, like indentations with your fingers in wet clay. Impressions are made upon the mind, and it begins to absorb certain things through sensory perception, touch and eye and ear and so forth. Various nerves, your auditory, your optical nerves, sense impressions come in and make an impression upon the mind. And then gradually, here we go again, gradually a body of knowledge will be the end result. So the empiricist is really diametrically, anyone who tries to hold this in a pure fashion is diametrically opposed to the rationalist. So this basically is empiricism. Of course, I could go on and give more examples, but you know what modern science is. You had biology or something where you went out and collected specimens and dissected and looked through microscopes and proved and wrote in a journal and diary and then passed the test about that. How could that be wrong? Well, let me say this. Some negative voices have been raised against this theory. Raised against this theory as the all-inclusive, infallible theory. Now, there's a lot to this that's true. A whole lot. You know, you're not born knowing how to walk. There are various things that you go through. You watch and observe others. You begin to do it yourself. And we could say, empirically, you learn what walking is all about. You're not born with innate ideas about locomotion. But in any type of pure form of epistemological empiricism, negative voices have been raised. I want to give you about, we'll just say a handful. I don't know how many I'll break this up into, but a handful. First of all, these are negative voices. First of all, the negative voice of verification. Verification has been raised against this theory. These are things that you need to try to think about as we're going along in our study tonight. It has implications because people fall under one or more of these categories, and some try to defend these justifications of the origin of knowledge, and they really don't know what they're talking about. Verification. This is a negative voice. You think, well, a positive voice, because that's what empiricism is all about. You verify the experience by proving it, by demonstrating. Well, here's what I mean by a negative voice of verification. He will ask, he may be a rationalist or he may be a subjectivist, the next category. In other words, he's an opponent to epistemological empiricism. He will ask this question. He will say, now, is something true, or are we to believe something only after it's been verified empirically? Is that the way the world really works? Is that the way the scientist really works? Outside his laboratory, maybe. Or some would say even inside his laboratory. Is something true, or are we to believe it to be true only after it's been verified? In other words, must we prove it directly from the facts before accepting it? That's true. Well, of course not. There are many things that we believe where we either don't know the facts or we can't get at them, such as nuclear particles. There's a lot of talk, friends, about electrons, neutrons, protons, neutrinos, things like that. No one has ever seen one. No one has ever proven that there's any such thing. We've been raised. I'm going to read you some quotations from people like Einstein, what he had to say about these laws of science. We've been raised with those things, but no one has ever proven that. There's almost like a conspiracy, although I hate to use that term because of how often it's misused. It's an unconscious conspiracy by man, definitely conscious by the devil, to cause people to worship the scientific method and not realize that a lot of these ideas can date back to day X, Y, or Z when someone began to formulate this theory, like Darwin, an origin of the species. Could you prove that? Not if your life depended on that. But it's become accepted as a fact today. You say, well, I reject that as a believer. All right. See, there's one thing that has been, quote, proven, unquote, by the scientific community. They say that it's proven, and you say it's just a bunch of hogwash. They say also, with the same type of evidence, which is not conclusive evidence, that there is such thing as electrons and protons and neutrons. No one's ever seen one or proven that. No one's ever seen a neutrino. You know what a neutrino is? That's those bursts of whatever that come from the sun. What is it, 100 trillion of them pass through you per second from the sun? They come up with all these things, neutrinos. And there are little neutrino catchers, little bags that catch neutrinos. That's right. You know, you read about it if you study some. You probably remember that. Some of you shake your head yes now if this is familiar with you back from high school or college days, you know, when it's not new. To some of you, it's new. To most of you, it looks like. Neutrinos. Yeah, they're little neutrino bags. Really, it's not a bag. It's a liquid, water. And neutrinos get in the water and you can somehow detect them. But of course you can't. It's impossible. They're invisible, immaterial, and all this type of stuff. And yet the empiricist is one who wants to collect, weigh, analyze, document. You can't do that to neutrons, protons, electrons, and you certainly can't do it to neutrinos. So nuclear particles. I'm saying there are things that we believe where we either don't know the facts or we can't get at them. I'll give you another example that the empiricist generally never thinks of. How about ancient history? How about ancient history? How about the existence of a Julius Caesar or a Mark Antony or a Cleopatra? Now you demonstrate that to me. You can't, yet you believe it with all your heart that there were really people by those names that existed. You couldn't demonstrate it if your life depended on it. See, it's not only what you might think of right away, well, yeah, electricity and nuclear particles, there's no way you could get at that. There's no way you can get at ancient history. What you're doing is you're believing somebody who believes somebody who believes somebody who said that they saw Julius Caesar. In other words, your belief is based upon the testimony that you take in good faith, and it may not be wise to do that, but that you take in good faith from someone else. So, verification is a negative voice that's been raised against empiricism. Empiricism works in some areas, but there's some areas that it will not work. It's almost like you just have to take it by faith. You either take it by faith or you deny it by faith. But you couldn't prove it or disprove it, one way or the other. Now, if verification were really true in empiricism, they say, well, we can verify everything we believe. Well, let's take it a step further, still in this negative voice of verification. If verification were really true in empiricism, then you would have to verify every verification ad infinitum to know whether or not that verification is verified. See, if you go out and collect some specimens and then you do something with them, then you've got to verify everything that's related to everything that you've done. And everything that's related to everything that you've done is also related to a whole lot of other things that's going on at the same time. So you'd have to verify every verification ad infinitum, which would be an absurdity. And so the empiricist said, well, you got us there. So maybe it's not really an issue, verification. Maybe, let's come to a second voice here, the question is verifiability. This is different now. Maybe we haven't verified everything we believe, the empiricist would say. So that isn't a prerequisite to knowledge. But then is verifiability. You see, verification asks the question, has it been? Verifiability asks the question, can it be verified? A little difficult to follow, but it's not difficult for me. I'm familiar with this, I guess. Well, we talked about a similar situation a couple of weeks ago with something being, a belief being unjustified and a belief being unjustifiable. Those are two different concepts there. One asks, has it been? One asks, can it be justified? So you might say, well, it's never been justified. Well, could it be? Is it within the realm of possibility? Then whether or not we have or not, at least it exists within the realm of possibility, which then already leads to credence in the view of the empiricist. Now, this came out of the Vienna circle of the logical positivists community. We're going to study them in a little more detail later on, another connection. And I think we have an early tape on the Vienna circle in Christian ethics. We looked at logical positivism. The Vienna circle was a circle of philosophers and theologians in Vienna back in, the 1920s, I believe. I don't have those dates with me now, but it was a circle of thinkers. They became known as the Vienna circle. And they had a philosophy called logical positivism. And this question, raising of this question of verifiability as differentiated from verification, was brought up by them. But another philosopher, a more modern one, Mavrides, had this to say. He said, sometimes we cannot tell if a statement is verifiable until we have determined that it's true. And if that statement of Mavrides is true, then that's a form of what we would call begging the question. See, he said sometimes you can't determine whether something is verifiable, whether it lies within the realm of being verifiable, until you have determined that it is true. Not whether or not it's true, but that it is true. Let me give you an example. Take the statement, the moon is composed of graham crackers and oatmeal. That's what the moon is made of, right? That will be our statement for right now. The moon is made up of graham crackers and oatmeal. Now, that statement is falsifiable. These terms we're going to be using until we get out of epistemology. Verifiable, falsifiable. Some things are verifiable. Some things are falsifiable, but not verifiable. That's falsifiable. How do we know that? Well, all you have to do is go to the moon, and we have been there. Now, until you have been to the moon, maybe you wouldn't know whether or not it's falsifiable. Now it is. You can just go and dig into it, get a shovel and hack, pack away and dig something out, and you find out whether it's oatmeal and graham crackers or whether it's something else. That's falsifiable. But as Mavrides has said, is it verifiable? Is that statement verifiable? Well, you'd have to determine that it's true before you could say anything about its verifiability. So in the long run, you end up begging the question about the whole issue, not only of verification now, but of verifiability. Well, moving along, I don't know, maybe that went over your head. Let's get down underneath then, underneath the table, to a third negative voice. Third negative voice, which is going to have several parts to it. A basic misunderstanding exists in the mind of the public over the scientific method, quote unquote, in general. I mean, a tremendous amount of trust is placed in the scientist and in his worshipped methods. But I want to give you a few of the negative points which have been raised against the worshipped methods of modern science, whether it's medical or some other type, astrophysical science, whatever. I want to give you some of the negative voices which have been raised against the worshipped methods of science, and because a lot of people aren't aware of these negative voices, then a basic misunderstanding exists in the mind's eye of the general public over the scientific method. First of all, the scientist uses instruments rather than physical senses because such senses, such as eyesight, for example, are not accurate enough. I mean, the surveyor, does he use an instrument or does he use his eyesight? His eyesight's not accurate enough. The astronomer, what does he use, an instrument or eyesight? Most scientists, that's the scientific method. You can't use your own senses because they're not accurate enough. They're too limited, too finite. So you have to use an instrument. But the problem with that is his senses are what built that instrument. So again, we're into a vicious circle here. That whole instrument and all the trust you put in that, in an indirect way, is trust that you put in your own senses which built that. I mean, has anything been made that's not been made? Everything that exists has been made. Every house has a builder, Paul said in Hebrews 3. And yet God built all things. But everything that's built has a builder behind it. Every instrument has been made. And it's been made by what? Well, again, by hands. Now, you say, well, no, instruments aren't made by hands. Instruments are made by other instruments, like in the tool and die industry. But what made the first thing, though? Some man with his own hands had to form the first thing that then becomes the instrument to form everything else. See, in a production line, hands don't make the things. Instruments put things together and make them and form them. But who made the instruments that now put the other instruments together? Eventually, you're going to trace it back to man. So see, he has a great distrust in his physical senses because they are not accurate enough, and yet his senses are what built the instruments. In other words, there may be built-in defects. There may be built-in defects in those instruments because they were made by a fallible man. One writer had this to say about the scientist in this little scenario here. He said, and I quote, he's not only checking his theory with observations, but his observations by means of theory-dependent instruments. He's not only checking his theory. You've got a certain theory about, well, whatever, the Doppler effect or supernovas or black holes or whatever. He's not only checking his theory with observations, but his observations by means of a theory-dependent instrument. That's a very remarkable statement there. You're checking your theory that you have, that some incredible theory, let's say of the astrophysicist, you're checking your theory by observations because you've got to analyze to find out whether or not it's right. And yet your observations are performed with the help of theory-dependent instruments. Various theories, such as the theories of mathematics. Now, they may be right and they may be wrong. But see, the empiricist doesn't believe in innate ideas, so how do you know that what you think you believe about a triangle, or what you think you believe about falling bodies, or what you think about bodies at rest or bodies in motion, really apply in any other circumstance or situation besides where you are right now? You'll see more of what I mean by that here in a moment when I read you a quote. Well, here's the second problem I'd state under this, that scientists, and people don't realize this, they don't just report facts or write up statistics like they're totally neutral. Mr. Gray, he's totally neutral. They don't only report facts and write up statistics, but they are constantly involved in analyzing and evaluating and interpreting those facts. In other words, there's much room for bias and error to creep in there. You understand what we're trying to get at tonight? You know, the public's view of the scientist is this man who has no biases, no prejudice at all. He wants to understand the mating habits of the red ant, and so all he does is he just watches red ants. He collects them and puts them together, and he just sits there. He has no bias, no prejudice. He's just a totally neutral individual. And he observes and watches and times and weighs, and then he records all of that. And then the public says, well, you know, since there's nothing that could have gone wrong in his whole process of acquiring knowledge, then we put 100% faith in that. And they do. They think the scientist, he was just a disinterested observer who stood by with folded arms, just letting the experiment run its course, and then he simply wrote down the results of it all. That's not the way that it happens. That's not the way that it happens. Amen. He doesn't only write a report up afterwards, he's always involved in weighing and analyzing and figuring out and then double-checking and, well, interpreting the facts that he sees. I've already given you a good example throughout the creation class of the geologist, so-called disinterested man, no bias, no room for error, just a man who just wants to find out some things about the earth. So what does he do? He goes out and collects rocks and digs here and probes there and ships these home and folded arms, disinterested observer, bystander. And then he said, well, now, such and such is true. The earth is 14 trillion years old.
For the continuation of this message,
and then he said, well, now, such and such is true. The earth is 14 trillion years old. And yet, what have I told you before? That he already has. He's not only checking the facts, but he's checking the facts based on some theories that he's already devised, such as this theory, that if something's found 10 feet underground, then it's 10 years old. 20 feet, it's 20 years old. 30 feet, it's 30 years old. In other words, he's already divided the strata up. He's already told himself that, and things found in certain strata equal certain dates. He's not a disinterested observer. He's already worked his theory into the universe out there, and now he's checking the facts based on his theory. He's not checking his theory based on the facts. He's checking the facts based on his theory, which gives much room for error to creep in. A third objection here would be along this line, that our five senses, or what we receive by them, is influenced by our expectations. Is influenced by our expectations. And those expectations don't arise just from the sense experience that is going on around us right now, but they arise from a host of complicated features, such as culture, group loyalties, color of skin, religious commitments, degree of education, and so forth. Let me go back and say that. I said that our five senses, or what we receive by them, is really a better way to say it, is influenced by our expectations. Well, to give you a good example, transfer it over to the spiritual realm. And surely this is more or less a law that, as someone has said here just recently, that if you go to another church, you don't go to another church just totally unbiased, or to another religious gathering totally unbiased. You go with a whole complicated back from when you were born or born again, set of various things that you can't put your finger on that make up you. That's why you are you and not me, or why you aren't us, but you're you. All types of input that you've had. And so you go now, not just I'm totally unbiased here, you go with certain expectations. And more times than not, what happens? Your expectations are fulfilled. In other words, you go and you were just expecting it to be good, and sure enough it was. Now, was it really good, or were you not more influenced by your expectations than anything else? Or you go and it was really bad. Well, maybe you were influenced by maybe it was bad, but maybe you were also influenced by your expectations. So when the scientist, he's not totally neutral. He's already kind of guessing what he's going to get out of this experiment. The closer he gets to the end, the more he's expecting a certain result. And pretty soon you become so accustomed to that expectation. You're expecting it so much that you don't know that you've crossed the line now from an uninterested or disinterested observer. You've crossed the line over now to having a personal say-so, a personal bias in the outcome of this experiment. You don't know that you've crossed the line now because your expectations have grown so much. And then what happens is maybe your theory doesn't really work out the way that you thought that it would, but you're so expecting it to that it appears to you, when in reality that's not true at all. By the way, this book is probably, you may not want this on your shelf, but I'll just mention this for to be real technical here. But there's a book by Thomas Kuhn entitled "The Structure of Scientific Revolutions." It was published 20 years ago in 1970 by the University of Chicago Press, and he deals with all of these things. Very interesting book, "The Structure of Scientific Revolutions." And he shows that scientific revolutions aren't really caused by a lot of facts. They're caused by a lot of expectations that men start having. And what they see at the end of the day is not reality. It's kind of a mirage that they have been forced into seeing because of their expectations. Now, I know that's hard probably for some of you to swallow, because you just think, there's no way that the laws of motion and laws of rest and all this can really be false after all these centuries. Because after all, we're using them all the time. Well, wait till I read some quotes here from people who know more about science than all of us put together. Let me give you a fourth point under this. What are we on? The third one, but a fourth one under that. I just said in the third place that the outcome of our experiments as scientists is more often influenced by our expectations than anything else. Therefore, in the fourth place, the scientists usually fail to recognize data that contradict their theories because they're not expecting to be wrong. And if they ever do see it, you know what they call it? A problem, quote unquote, or a kink, quote unquote, that needs to be worked out, a bug that needs to be worked out, rather than the first little tidbit of evidence or proof that their whole theory is false. See, that's the way the scientist works all the time. Well, now, we've tried this and it didn't totally work. A couple of kinks there, and they still need to be worked out. A bug or two needs to be worked out. Now, he calls it a kink or a bug that needs to be worked out, rather than detecting, well, maybe that's the first proof against the validity of my entire theory here. He never suspects that he's wrong, so he never suspects that to be the first inclination, the first hint toward disproving his theory. He just said, well, it's something unexplained. We don't know exactly what to do with it right now, but we're going to go back to the lab and put our coats back on and work on it some more. And pretty soon, you see, he's not willing to say, that kink may just be telling us that we're dead wrong. We're up a wrong alley now. He won't allow himself to be told that, so he goes back. He keeps on expecting to be right, and pretty soon, he's able to cause that kink to disappear. He just calls it to disappear. Oh, it's still there. And his theory ends up being wrong, and the results aren't what the general public is made to believe. Generally, the only way that the scientist ever changes is you have to have a flood of evidence against it. Now, if you've got a flood of evidence against it, then he wakes up and begins to take notice. Well, I promise you some excerpts. How about this from Albert Einstein? I think he knew more about science than all of us put together, right? You would want to challenge him in a math game, would you? Maybe in a Bible game. Amen. But not in a math game. All right, now here's what Einstein said. This is a direct quote. He's talking about how nature works. The laws of nature, how it works. And here's his quote. We know nothing about it at all. Our knowledge is but the knowledge of school children. We shall know a little more than we do now, but the real nature of things, as they really are, that we shall never know. Never. See, some who have really gotten deep into it, they know they're not going to tell you, friends. They'd be pulling the rug out from under themselves then. Tell you that, we're just a bunch of guys who sit around with a lot of fancy instruments, putting all of our faith in them, not in our senses, forgetting that we designed those instruments, so they've got built-in defects. If you don't trust your senses, how can you trust what's been made by your senses? They're not going to tell you anything like that, because then the world's not going to follow them anymore. See, we live in a very scientific world right now, very scientific world, very empirical world, where people believe what they see. You don't see it, you don't believe it. Seeing is believing, they say. Seeing is believing. Analyzing, weighing, capturing is believing. Well, let me see if I can find some... here's another one from another scientist. He said science, especially physics, listen to this, does not deal with the world we live in. It deals with an imaginary world where there are absolute vacuums, frictionless surfaces, bodies whose masses are concentrated at a geometrical point, and tensionless strings. And then they build their theories based on that, and none of that we've ever experienced. None of that exists in this world. This is really true. You get some books on your hands like Kuhn's about scientific revolutions, and you'll see how revolutions are more influenced by culture and religious or non-religious notions and ideas and things than they are influenced by cold, hard facts. I mean, evolution was not influenced by the cold, hard facts. It was influenced by delusions in somebody's mind and views about the age of the earth and so far. Those aren't influenced by what can be seen and tested and analyzed. It's influenced by other matters, group loyalties. It might have been influenced by what you had to drink last night, like too many drinks last night. They just think that the scientist is a non-man. He's somewhere between man and God. He's like just a robot. He's neither married nor not married. I mean, he's just not in any category. I mean, all these men that make up these things, they're married or they're not. They're fornicators or they're not. They have children or they don't. They have headaches. They have to go to the restroom. They have problems. They have depression. They're human beings. And we think, we just worship their methods. Their methods are only as good as the men are. I'm going to read you that sentence again to pick up the context. Science, especially physics, does not deal with the real world, the world we're in. It deals with an imaginary world where there are absolute vacuums. You hear about that all the time, such and such in a vacuum. No one has ever seen a vacuum. I mean, no one has ever experienced, not even space out there is an absolute vacuum. It doesn't have, space out there is closer to a vacuum than we are on this earth, that's for sure. But space is not an absolute vacuum. And yet all the theories are dependent upon, we're going to build this theory, and this would be true in an absolute vacuum. And yet the absolute vacuums don't exist, so why be wasting your time with the theory? Frictionless surfaces. That's a good one. A surface that's frictionless. That's really a good one. Bodies whose masses are concentrated at one geometrical point and tensionless strings. For example, the writer says, the law of the pendulum applies to such an imaginary world. It describes no actual pendulum. The law of freely falling bodies applies in such an imaginary world. It describes no actually falling bodies. Science does not describe the behavior of things we see, but of the things the scientists imagine, including electrons, protons, and quarks. Those aren't things that we see or that we could prove or demonstrate. They're things that the scientist sees or that he wants to see in order to build a theory upon. And this is all coming from... here's another one. I skipped over this. This is by another well-known scientist. The way in which knowledge progresses, epistemology. How do we get knowledge? Listen to this. The way in which knowledge progresses, and equally our scientific knowledge, is by unjustified and unjustifiable anticipations, by guesses, by tentative solutions to our problems, by conjectures. They can never be positively justified. They can never be established as certainly true, nor even as probable. Now, if you've got a hard time with these statements and what you brought up scientifically with, remember, these are coming from renowned scientists. Popper here and Einstein earlier, from renowned scientists whose whole life has been spent here, but who perhaps are not quite as biased as some others who won't tell you what their biases are. All right, so there are three negative voices. Let me give you a fourth negative voice against epistemological empiricism. I won't spend much time here, but that is this, that many examples exist of how our senses can deceive us. And remember that the empiricist is totally dependent on his senses, even if he forgets that his senses were earlier used to make instruments so that he wouldn't have to use his senses. And many examples exist of how our senses deceive us. I'll give you one example. How about hunting for fish with a bow and arrow? We think that we know that light, or that water rather, acts like a prism. And a prism bends light. And so whenever you look down in the water, the ancient Indians had to learn this. Whenever you look down in the water and you see the fish is really not where you think that he is. Because water acts like a prism and it bends light. You know what prisms are. Not prisons, a prism. So, I'm just saying there's one common example, or there's so many other examples, like if you stand out in the middle of what? Western United States, out there where it's just flat as far as you can see, and get up on a railroad track and look. And way in the distance, what happens to the two railroad lines that are beside you? They converge, don't they? Never tried that before? All the time, you can buy in a book on illusions. You know how most magicians act? They act, the way they make their living is by illusions. I got books on magic and magicians in there, and they play on misconceptions that people have. They play on how our senses can deceive us when we think that we see something in a certain way and it's really not. I was in my study just the other day, and I thought I might just bring everybody in here and show them that. I was standing in a certain place in my study looking at a certain object, and it was bent. And then I just thought, man, I can't imagine I bought something and it was warped like that. And I went over and rubbed my hand and looked at it and then put a ruler. Now, see, my ruler was made by senses, so maybe the fellow who made that, you see, was also bent. Everything's dependent. But I was trusting my ruler on that day, and I put my ruler something flat up against it, a flat edge, and wasn't bent. And I walked away from it again. I looked at it, and there it goes again. And then you just look at it, and you bring some more light on it. It's the light. The light is causing, and shadows and everything cause funny things to happen. Yeah, you go and stand on a railroad track. If it's flat enough, far enough, those lines converge. But what have we been taught, though? Two parallel lines will never meet. They get neither closer nor farther apart, do they? Or do they? See, here again we have a problem. All we've been able to observe, now we'll pretend these are parallel, okay? Two parallel lines. We're told that they get neither closer nor farther apart. Well, for how long? Well, I know as long as I can write them here, but see what the mathematician tells us is into infinity. The only problem is we've never seen parallel lines in their infinity, though. All we know is what we're dealing with here in our own realm and world, parallel lines that we can see right now. I don't know, way in infinity. Now, I think that's probably an innate idea that we would take, that two parallel lines, two bodies running beside each other, and I don't mean that there's any slight divergence. perfectly parallel, if there was any such thing as that. They're perfectly parallel. I think it's probably an innate idea that they will never, ever meet. But we really don't know that because we don't live in infinity. It's like talking about things that prevail in a vacuum. How do you know? You can't even create an absolute vacuum. Don't be fooled by the scientists who tell you they've made a vacuum and that they have performed certain experiments in there. You can't make a perfect vacuum. You can't make anything greater than you are yourself. No one can, as I've said before, and even the mathematicians will tell, no one has ever seen a perfect circle drawn. You could say no one has seen perfectly parallel lines. Because what are parallel lines made by but fallible, finite creatures? And if you could superimpose on my lines, assuming that they were drawn by a machine here, all the magnification of infinity, they're probably not parallel then. One of them is just slightly bending toward the other one. But of course you would never know that. So we just pretend like parallel lines are really parallel, and we start working on that basis. The whole problem is that if you happen to be wrong, then every conclusion that you reach is also wrong. It's like our study in eschatology. Before the end is right, you've got to have all the pieces of the puzzle put together. And you start pulling one little piece out, and that whole table will collapse in. It's got to have 4 legs to stand on, not just 3. So many examples exist of how our senses deceive us. See, railroad tracks don't really come together. You could walk over there 5 miles where they're coming together, and whenever you get there, they'll be just like they were whenever you left the earlier point, parallel. But then now you see 5 miles in the future. Now they're together. In the distance, now I see them. So you walk that 5 miles. Still parallel. Yet your eyes, the way your eyes are, they look like they're getting closer and closer together. Someone says, well, I guess that's due to the fact that the earth is curved. Well, maybe it is. Put them on a flat plane into infinity, and then see what they would look like. I don't know. Let's give you another negative voice then. And that's this. This is really a good one here. I'm going to really get some of you on this one. Empiricism is too limited. It's too limited. It can be helpful in some areas, but it's too limited. It doesn't have the ability to check all the claims to knowledge. You know, sometimes whenever you're studying epistemology, philosophy, logic, things like that, then you hear that there's such a thing called a syllogism, where you have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And if you believe, if it's true, the major premise and the minor premise, then the conclusion is true. And the premise that you often, or the syllogism that you often see to teach first-year students what syllogisms are, will go something like this. A, all men are mortal. B, Socrates was a man. You ever seen this before? Surely you have. Therefore, Socrates was mortal. That's generally the first syllogism that you're introduced to in philosophy. Well, let me throw a little kink into that syllogism. From the point of view of the empiricist now. Say, what could you challenge in that? All men are mortal. All men are mortal. Right? Yeah, all men are mortal. Socrates was a man. Now, forget about ancient history. We're just assuming we're going to believe that. We can't get our hands on ancient history. We're going to believe that minor premise, that Socrates was a man. Well, you can't escape the conclusion there. Therefore, Socrates was mortal. Well, I'm saying here that empiricism is too limited. It can't check all the claims to knowledge. Let's talk about specifically this first one. This is a claim to knowledge right here that all men are mortal. Well, I have a question. Can the statement all men are mortal be empirically verified? You see, before you can reach your conclusion, before this can be true, your premises have to be true. And before you can even deal with the second minor premise, you've got to deal with the first major premise that all men are mortal. And I'm asking you, we're talking about empiricism and some problems with it, can that statement, all men are mortal, can that be empirically verified? You don't know whether it can or not. You know what empiricism is. You check, you weigh, you analyze. We're not talking about something too difficult here. We're just talking about men. You can see them, weigh them. They weigh 160, 180, 215. And color and skin type and height and all of this. No. Amen. Can that be empirically verified that all men are mortal? I doubt it, and I'll tell you why. Because of its universal nature. General or universal propositions are beyond the reach of empiricism. Now, is it verifiable? Well, yeah, it's verifiable. Can it be verified? I mean, if you could get to every man, then you can find out whether or not he's mortal. That answers the question of verifiability. It is verifiable. If you can get to every man, you could verify. Cut off his head, pull off both arms, yank his lungs and his heart out, and find out is he still alive. If he is, he's probably not mortal. But if he's a man, he'll be dead by the time you get through with that. Hence, you've proven that he's immortal. It's verifiable. Can you verify it? One asks the question, can you really go out there and do it? Or has someone done it? I mean, is it within the realm of possibility? I'm saying that if you could get out there, then yes, you could verify it. But can you get out there and do it? Well, before you could even get on the plane to leave to verify your first man, probably 18,000 have just died that second. There's some men dying. And then while you're verifying, let's say in Arizona, and you've touched base everywhere in Arizona, just as you're crossing over the state line, 7,400 people were born. You got to go back now and verify whether or not they are. In other words, because of the fact that we're dealing with a universal proposition here, because of the fact we're dealing with over 5 billion people, you could never check every one of them. People don't even know where every one of them happens to be right now. You could send out a great team of scientists. You'd have to first come upon the criteria by which you'll know whether or not a man is mortal. And how are you going to prove? How are you going to prove that he is mortal, that he isn't, short of death, short of trying to execute him? I mean, you could stick him and say, well, he bleeds. Well, maybe the gods bleed. But we know this is a strange creature. If you could yank out all his internal organs, electrocute him, inject him with poisons, run over him with a train, smash him with a Mack truck, drop him from a 10-story building, and shoot him with some lasers, and decapitate him, and hang him, and, I don't know how you can do both, and crucify him, and drown him. Now, is he still alive? Well, we would say, well, it doesn't matter. You could never even get out there and do it anyway. So the empiricist here who tells us that I know from, all he can tell us is I know from the men that I have met that this statement is true. All men are mortal. I don't know if all men are mortal, though, unless I'm going to go on some other basis besides empiricism. Or unless I'm going to extrapolate and say, well, I have met many men, and every one I've met, no exception, every one I've met is mortal, therefore it must be true everywhere. But that's not empiricism, though. Empiricism has to be able to prove it. You've got to analyze, collect your specimens, and demonstrate it. You can't do that, not with general or with universal propositions. And let me say something else about it anyway. Let's say that you did cut his head off, and you did all those things I just mentioned. I've just proven that this is a mortal creature here. You forgot about something, though. His soul, which is invisible and intangible, is immortal. It's indestructible. You can't get your hands on it. He would walk away from that pile of broken bones and bloody skin, wiping his apron, saying, well, I proved that he was just a mortal. And you don't know that that man is alive and conscious somewhere. You'd have no way of guessing that, no way of knowing that at all. That man is alive and conscious somewhere. See, we'll get that from revelation, from special revelation. How would you know that? From what you can see, a man is no different than a dog that's hit on the highway. When you're hit, you're dead. You're gone. There's nothing there, just a body of clay now. Special revelation would tell us that man, he's more immortal than you thought he was. He'll live forever and ever. Or I'll give you another example. You understand what I'm saying by this? Whenever you get into universal propositions, as long as you're just saying, this man is mortal, well, maybe you could demonstrate that to your own satisfaction, but you couldn't to yours or anybody that every man is mortal because of the broadness of that. You can't reach every man. How about some other propositions like this one? 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, that's not so specific after all. The opponent to empiricism, or the one who just wants to show you that it's not all it's cut out to be by a lot of people in their mind's eye. By a lot of people and by the opponents of this, they would say, this isn't just a particular proposition. We can make this into a general one. Are you saying that this 2 plus this 2 equals 4? Is that really what the mathematician is saying? He's saying that every 2 plus every 2 equals 4, right? You got to think when you go through it. He's not saying this 2 right here and this one equals that one. We'll accept that. He's not making that claim. He's saying that every 2, whenever you add it to any and every, you could pick any 2 you want to. A green one or a red one or any type of 2, but just pick a 2. And if you add it, it'll equal 4. Well, demonstrate that to us. Again, you couldn't, because you'd have to empirically support this into infinity. All you can deal with are the 2s that you picked. See, in other words, the empiricist is going to have to say, you know what, when it comes to universal 2 plus 2s, I can't be an empiricist. I'm going to have to be, maybe a rationalist. And say, I guess there's some innate ideas that if 2 plus 2 equals 4, then all. Well, one woman who makes a good wife doesn't mean all women could be good wives. I mean, you don't believe that. One woman might be a good wife, but does that mean that all things that are called woman would be a good wife for you as a believer? Hardly is that true. And there are other things that are outside of the bounds of empiricism. The future, can't be an empiricist when it comes to the future, can you? You got to be something else, a hoper, a wisher, or a faither. Or as Hume himself said, ethical values, goodness and badness, rightness and wrongness in actions. How do you know that it's right or wrong? How could you demonstrate that? You couldn't. Your belief about that, and everyone has a belief, whether you're a John Stuart Mill or a Protagoras or Aristotle or Plato or Isaiah or Paul. Everyone has a belief about rights and wrongs. Where did you get your belief about rights and wrongs? You didn't get it from your experience. You may have gotten some of your beliefs, but you didn't get it from experience. What about empiricism? I would say. And the empiricist would say, well, yeah, and so is God. He's outside of the bounds of empiricism. All right, well, for the empiricist, that rules out God, and for the Christian, that rules out empiricism.